Greetings. As I speak to you today, we've recently had our granddaughter on reaching on the secular calendar in current use the age of 1 year old. And I want to give you a riddle. What do you call a cow that just had a baby? What do you call it? What's the title? How do you describe a cow that just had a baby? Decaffeinated. Hope you like that. Last week, I quoted from James 1:19. Unfortunately, I said James 1:18 when I read the quotation. So I do want to apologize for that. Let's see if I can get through this week without making that kind of a mistake. So hang in there. I spoke about speaking last week. I spoke about speech. And I could have quoted from Ecclesiastes, the book of wisdom, great wisdom literature, as we say in the Bible. We have some literature that's called wisdom literature. And Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 7, it says, there's a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. So we need to be wise enough to know when to speak and when not. So I believe that right now it is a time for me to speak. And today I want to speak about a wrestling prophet. A wrestling prophet. And I'll say more about that as I go along. There many of us, as I'm speaking in this time, when I'm speaking, many of us are praying for the recovery of Dennis Prager, who took evidently a very serious fall. And he tells a story which I'm going to repeat in a very inaccurate way probably, but the general idea that he was asked why he wasn't a Muslim, and so he said, well, Islam means submission, but Israel means he who struggles with God. And so he said, my approach is that I struggle with God. And recently, Jordan Peterson has written a book that as I'm speaking, is a bestseller currently. And it's called We Who Wrestle with God. I haven't read the book, but evidently it focuses on material in Genesis and Exodus. So in a certain sense, God's people struggle with God, and there's two ways of looking at that. And one way would be that we need to maintain a right relationship with God. He's given us the most precious of gifts, salvation, but then he expects us to value that gift and to live accordingly and to develop a relationship with him. And that takes effort. We have to be overcomers. And so we, in effect, have to struggle with God. And we have to be overcomers, And if you go back to Genesis 32 and verse 28, I want to read the New King James translation of that. Genesis 32 and verse 28. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. So we need to be overcomers, and so we do need to. And there are a lot of scriptures on that. Hebrews 11 talks about in verse 13, I believe it talks about how our spiritual ancestors embraced, the promises, your God's promises. And we're told in 1 Thessalonians, prove all things and hold fast that which is good. And also John wrote to the church in Philadelphia, back in what is today Turkey. Hold fast that no man take your crown. So we have to embrace, in effect, and struggle and hang on, to the commitment that we have made so that because we have, as I said, this priceless gift of salvation. On the other hand, we also struggle because we have questions for which we don't have answers, and we have to deal with it. We have to be honest, recognize it, and then try to deal with it as best we can. And then, of course, that requires faith. I want to go to Psalm 34 and verse 8 on that. Psalm 34 and verse 8. So yes, if you live God's way of life, you see it's the best way of life to live. But on the other hand, you will have your doubts, and you need faith. So I'm in Psalm 34 verse 8. And it says, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. God's way of life is the best way of life. But then it says, blessed is the man who trusts in him. So when we have these areas of struggle intellectually, sometimes quite emotionally, it is our faith that carries us through. And as 2 Corinthians tells us, we live by faith, not by sight. Ultimately, we don't see tangibly. We don't see God in the way we see physical things, nor have we received the promises that He's made for us. But yet we have the faith that we have belief in God, belief in the reality that the Bible describes, and belief in the promises that the Bible gives us. So all of that could be, in a way, summarized in the meaning of a prophet's name. Today I want to talk about the prophet Habakkuk, and his name could refer to a plant, I think an aromatic plant. And in Isaiah 5:7, God's people are in that sense a precious plant to God. But also, his name could be relating to the word to embrace. And so, in a sense, he's one who has embraced, who has clung to God's promises, to the beliefs and practices of the Torah. But he's also one who has struggled. He has wrestled with God because he, as you'll see, he had questions, and God answered his questions. So we'll get to that, but this is all of an introduction as a general theme of the book. A general theme of the book is that here was a prophet who had questions, came to God with his questions, God answers, and then finishes with a very positive psalm at the conclusion of the book. It's only 3 chapters. This book had a profound influence, evidently, on the Essene community that lived around the Dead Sea at the time of Christ, because the Dead Sea Scrolls evidently include 2 chapters of Habakkuk, a commentary on the first 2 chapters of Habakkuk. And we see that the book has been preserved over the centuries, that if you have a Hebrew Habakkuk in front of you, it's not all that different from what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I want to go to Romans 1 and verse 17. A key passage out of Habakkuk is found 3 times in the New Testament. And Romans 1 and verse 17, Paul says, for speaking about, well, I'll go to the 16th verse to get the context. Paul says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So we do owe, the Jewish community has preserved for us the Old Testament, as it's called generally, and of course the calendar that underlies it is there implied. The Greeks have preserved the New Testament for us. So we go to you go to the Jews to find out what belongs in the Old Testament. That's where you go, and you go to the Greeks to find out what belongs in the New Testament. And of course, Greek could also be a general term for Gentiles. In other words, God first chose a certain nation as an example, but then the new covenant is now universal. And it goes on to say, for in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. There's various ways to understand that, but perhaps he's talking about the faith of the New Old Testament figures, and then the New Testament. That's one way of understanding it, or growing in faith. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So here he's quoting from Habakkuk, but not exactly. The Old Testament, the Masoretic version, it says the just shall live by his faith. The Septuagint version, the translation that the Greek-speaking Jews were using in Paul's day, says the just shall live by my faith. So rather than dealing with that issue, he just says the main point is faith. The just shall live by faith. And so that's a very important passage. It comes out of Habakkuk. And as I said, Habakkuk wrestled. He asked questions. He got answers. But for some questions that each of us have, I would imagine all of us have some questions we don't have answers for, and we live by faith. I want to go now to Romans. Well, actually, that's where I just went. So let me go to Hebrews 10 and verse 38. And here again, he's looking back to Habakkuk, as you'll see, Hebrews 10:37. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. And I think we can apply that to ourselves personally. We only have so long to live, and our lifespan is just a small percentage of human history. So we don't know how long we're going to live either. So that's all we have. To develop the kind of a right relationship with God, we have only our lifetime. And so in that sense, Christ is coming soon. Let's go on. But for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, I've actually gone back one verse. Well, I'll read 36 and 37 without interrupting myself. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Verse 38. Now the just shall live by faith. Again, he quotes that. But yet you're not focusing on the pronouns there. Now the just shall live by faith. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. And that is coming from the Septuagint version. And I'll read you the Masoretic version later. They're both in the Bible. They're both valid scripture. They're both in the canon. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So we're not to draw back. We have to, he who endures to the end shall be saved. We don't look back. We press on. There's a lot of scriptures. Luke 9:62 comes to mind. And as I said, Matthew 24:13 and so on. There's another reference to Habakkuk I want to turn to. And later, Paul wrote to the church in Galatia because evidently they were getting to the point where they were getting quite legalistic about the way they observed God's way of life, and were kind of obscuring, the main reason for all of it. The central personality in our lives is Jesus Christ, and we don't want to get so much into the weeds that we forget we don't see the forest for the trees, I guess would be the point. So in Galatians 3, and I want to go to verse 11, he says, but that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident. We can never be good enough for the gift that God is giving us. There's no way that we're going to be so perfectly righteous, so perfectly fulfilling the law, that we're going to be entitled to what God has in store for us. It's just not going to happen. So anyway, I'm reading Galatians 3:11. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Again, quoting from Habakkuk. So let's go now to Habakkuk, and there's only 3 chapters. So it's in the minor prophets because it's a short book. And the problem Habakkuk saw initially was that he was living in a time when the God's people were really, what's the right word? They were just not falling way short of what was expected. a very sinful society, a wicked society, a decadent society, and he was living in the middle of it. The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. I'm reading from Habakkuk now. O Lord, how long shall I cry and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. This is the kind of world that he lived in, evidently, in Judah at that time, the southern kingdom. Of course, the northern kingdom had already gone into captivity at that point. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded. So God does answer him. For I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told you. So God is going to, in fact, overwhelmingly deal with the situation. And he's going to do it with a people, the Chaldeans. I look at the Chaldeans as like the Levites of the Gentile people in that part of the world. The Chaldeans were very talented, but also they were very ferocious. And they were used to punish Judah, as we know. The Chaldean Empire conquered the Middle East, and there was a 70-year period when they were the, use the idiom, the top dog, in the Middle East. And then they were replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire. So this was a Neo-Babylonian Empire that eventually God used to deal with Judah. And evidently there was some level of repentance in Judah. We have the work of Jeremiah, we have the work of Ezekiel, we have the work of Daniel, so that Judah was given the opportunity to return. This was part of God's plan. And some did. And they had originally Zerubbabel and Joshua, then they had Ezra and Nehemiah, so they were able to maintain some level of commitment to the Sinaitic covenant. So we do have, in effect, God's church, and Jesus Christ, of course, comes to that community later on. So anyway, I'm going to read now. For indeed, I am, verse 6, I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are also swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagles that hasten to eat. If you go back to Daniel 7, the way the Babylonians are pictured there, the Chaldean Empire, they're pictured there, I'm in verse 4, a lion, and it had eagle's wings. They very quickly conquered the Middle East. But it's interesting that the wings were plucked off. There was Nebuchadnezzar was humiliated, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on the feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So Nebuchadnezzar, as we know, had a period of 7 years living as a wild animal, and afterwards was humbled and acknowledged God. And his empire was compared to gold compared to those that followed, silver, bronze, and finally iron and clay. Anyway, so he's talking about the Chaldeans, and I go to verse 9. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. So they should have had some awareness of the God of the Jews, but they, eventually, though Nebuchadnezzar did acknowledge God, but generally they didn't, and in fact were very spiteful about it. I think when you in Daniel 5, let me go to Daniel 5, and as the empire is about to fall, and they're celebrating, they're having a wild time, and I want to go to verse 3. This is this wild party before the handwriting on the wall in ancient Babylon. Then they brought the gold vessels that they had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, and iron, wood, and stone. And yet they had the example of Daniel there. So they were in effect defiant of God, and he dealt with them. Well, what's interesting is that another question arose from Habakkuk. Perhaps in vision he saw what was to come. He may have been around for it, or at least he saw it in vision. And then he said, "Well, they are so cruel, so vicious. I understand. You need to deal with the wickedness of my people, and they need to repent. But this was such a horrific calamity. I never dreamed it would go that far. You could say, and so now he's asking God, when is there going to be relief from this? So first he's complaining that there's no justice. Now he's complaining that I guess there's too much justice. We need mercy. Are you not from everlasting? I'm in verse 12. O Lord our God and my Holy One, we shall not die, O Lord. You have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil. You could not look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? And he goes on, and so we see in Habakkuk 2 that God says, "I am going to deal with them, and they're going to be dealt. They're going to be overcome and become in effect a derision." And there are 5 sections of woes. In Hebrew, hoy, in English, woe. And there are evidently 15 verses, beginning in verse 6, woe, and then you can keep on reading, and it finally ends in, the last woe is in verse 15, and then 16, 17, so that ends it. So you have 5 woes, pardon me, in 3 verses per woe, the punishment that is coming upon that empire. And I want to conclude by of course, there's a very strong condemnation here of idolatry, and we can have modern idolatry if we are focused too much on physical things to the exclusion of what is of the spiritual, because ultimately our future is a spiritual one. So anyway, in verse 20, he concludes, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." Now, at this point, as I said, perhaps Habakkuk is looking into the future, and the temple is still standing. In any case, God did see to it that the temple was rebuilt, and there may be a rebuilt temple before Christ returns, but in any case, there will be a millennial temple, and plus the church also is, as you know, a temple. And so God does have his worshipers and his holy place, and he is ultimately in charge, in control, and the world will be very, very well aware of that when Christ returns. Verse 20, "But the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him." And the second coming of Christ, in a way, is somewhat similar to the theophany at Sinai. There it was, he's coming back to the Mount of Olives, but he appeared, he in terms of his word, he is the word, and so the commandments that you see in Exodus 20 are coming from Jesus Christ, or the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, the Logos. And in Deuteronomy 33, we have Moses speaking of the theophany at Sinai. And now this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. The area of Petra or of the Edomites is near there. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them. So the children of Israel were assembled, and there was evidently an angelic host, and then there was the giving of the law amidst thunder. It's very dramatic if you read Exodus 19. And it also prefigures the second coming of Christ, which will be, of course, very dramatic. And we had a little taste of that on Pentecost when the church began. So anyway, in Habakkuk 3, we have now a psalm that Habakkuk adds to the book, and it's written evidently in a kind of intense, kind of a musical theme, a musical style that's kind of emotional in its impact. The term is shigionot, and it may come from the word to wander. So it may be a kind of an intense sort of music. A prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, on shigionot. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So, this is often going to be the prayer of God's people through history, that revive your work. But I want to go back to Habakkuk 2 because I quoted it 3 times in the New Testament. And as I said, as he questioned God and God's justice, he realized, in this case, God answered him, but all of us have some questions we don't have answers for. And so in Habakkuk 2 and verse 4, it says, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him. So we fail if we have that arrogance. Job had to understand that he is human and God is God, and he's going to have to understand that God ultimately knows what he's doing. And so Job said, I went overboard in my criticism of you. He repented in Job 42 and verse 6, and he had great blessings restored to him. He was a righteous person, but he evidently became hypercritical of God and had to be disciplined there. In Habakkuk 2 and verse 4, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. And as I said, in Septuagint, it's my faith. So in effect, God does supply the faith. We look to God for the faith. By the power of God that we overcome. It's not, we have our effort, but it is really through God's help, that we are able to overcome. That's why we have to maintain a connection with God. We need to be studying His Word regularly. We need to be praying regularly, fasting on occasion, thinking about God's Word. Prayer, study, fasting, meditation. That's basic to Christian living. And so that's in Habakkuk 2:4. And then in Habakkuk 3, in this psalm, we go through, this talks about Sinai, but it also projects forward to the second coming of Christ. And so we can look at it from that point of view. And when he concludes, he says, even when times are completely, out of hand, which will eventually come to the world, right before Christ's return, very dire times are going to hit the world because of human wickedness, and you read about that in Revelation. So, we are going to have great trauma before finally we have great joy. The labor pains, as it were, before the coming of the Messiah. And at the end of the book of Habakkuk it says, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Because ultimately, our future is to be not depending on any of these things. Our future is to be spirit, where we will be immortal and not suffer hunger or thirst or pain. That is our ultimate future. And then he goes on to be very positive at the conclusion of the psalm. The Lord God is my strength and will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. Will prance around, like a deer. And then he concludes it with what is normally an intro to the psalm, but he's already introduced the psalm in terms of the style of music that he wants. But now he also gives direction to the chief musician that he wants this performed on stringed instruments. To the chief musician with my stringed instruments. I think that one implication we can get out of this is that the chief musician, that term, could also mean the overcomer. And that is really, the theme of Habakkuk. That God's people need to be overcomers. We need to commit ourselves very strongly to beliefs and practices that God has revealed to us. We also need to struggle with doubts, but through faith to overcome the doubts and to continue our commitment to God to be overcomers. And so we understand that God says to him who overcomes, Revelation 3:21, that he'll sit with me on my throne as I have overcome and sit by my Father on his throne. And we know Romans 8 tells us that no matter what, we're really more than overcomers. If God be with us, who can be against us? You could look at Romans 8. I want to conclude this talk by going to Ephesians 2. And maybe this will encourage you to do a study of your own on Habakkuk and derive more insights and go with some of the information that I've shared with you, some of the insights that I hope and pray have been inspired and will be helpful. I want to go to Ephesians 2 and verse 20. Paul speaking about the church, as I said, as a temple. And here he says, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. So yes, our beliefs and practices, we focus on Jesus Christ and we study the words of the apostles and prophets. And today I'm talking about a prophet whom I feel appropriately I can label the wrestling prophet, Habakkuk. All the best to you and yours.